Hi, I'm Ashy, and this is Crafty with Ashy. Today I am painting a lavender plant with a ladybug crawling on it, and so I'm just going to show you that process. First, I just start with a simple-ish sketch, so just getting that kind of thick stalk of the lavender plant and then putting in lavender flowers up that stalk and just kind of spaced out, and getting the basics of the ladybug in there. So its body, its head, and kind of an indication ish of the legs. And then just drawing the flower above it and kind of behind it that it is crawling on. And so I'm doing a sketch for this one just because this part is going to be slightly more detailed than the rest of the painting. So you'll see that this is really the only one that I sketch out, I guess, fully. And even this, I don't fully sketch it out. I just kind of give an indication on some of these flowers that this is where they're going to be. I'll go in and actually define the flowers a little bit more with brush strokes, but I did go ahead and sketch. Now this is probably more detailed than it really needed to be on these petal shapes. So do with that what you will. If you want to make it less detailed and just go in with your brush and create the shapes, that is perfectly fine. And you might get a little bit more of a looser, more organic feel to it. But I kind of just use this as a basic guide to the flowers themselves. I was also using this to kind of refine what I wanted it to look like, how dense I wanted those flowers to be, basically. And then I use a kneaded eraser and roll over the entire thing just to lighten the entire thing. And then the parts that were still darker than my liking, I dab to lift up some of the extra graphite. Now, for the background of this, it's going to be very blurred. So not a lot of detail. So I'm just wetting the entire page here with clean water and then kind of stroking, dabbing, being very loose with how I'm putting in these greens. I'm starting with a light yellowy green, adding in some more darker shades here and there, but really just covering that entire page with a very pale green and going in to really just get that all the way covered. And then while it's still wet, I'm using a very damp, lightly damp brush. So wet it, dry it off to lift out paint in the areas that I wanted to keep a little bit more white so that the green and the purple didn't mix too much. So again, while the background's still wet, going in with the purple to let it bleed out and doing dabbing and splatters with a pale purple and then going in with this darker like bluish purple to make it look like some shadows on and just some variation in the colors of the flowers, but just going in very quickly, loosely, and defining that. And then same thing with the stems here. I just get a little bit darker wash of the green and add in some lines for those stems, but because it's all still wet and I'm working pretty fast here, I really saturated the paper. It's all still wet. These stems are going to bleed out a little bit. And then at times I do add just a little bit more water toward the edge of them to make them bleed out even more. And then once I did it, it wasn't bleeding out as much as I wanted. So I just went over again with a fresh coat of water essentially and blended them out and went in with more greens, yellowies, like some brighter colors to make them a little bit more suggested rather than defined. Now, once the background is all dry, so I did wait completely to let it dry, then I go in on this front in focus detailed stalk or flower or whatever it's called. And I just started at the top. I'm using the shape of this round brush to create these petals. So just at different angles with slightly different amounts of pressure, just kind of tapping the brush on the page and varying the shade of purple as I go as well. So getting more pink on some, more blue on some, but also letting the paint run out a little bit as I go. And then there are some spots that if I felt like it got a little bit too dark, I rinsed off the brush and lifted out some of the color. And then again on the second round, just going in with some deeper shades to create more shadows, lifting out to create highlights. It all is still wet, so it's blending and bleeding together here for the petals that I'm creating at this point. And then going in just with a little bit more of a vibrant pink to create more depth and contrast between different petals, just to add interest and variety. So then once I finish the petals, I go in and paint in the stem, and I started with just a really yellowy color. And then I decided to go in and add some splatters to the background and kind of dab in a little bit of water to loosen it up, but really just putting those on the purple areas with some purple splatters just to create a little bit more interest in the background. And I'm doing that now to let the flower dry so that I can go in and work on it more. So when doing watercolor, instead of just walking away and waiting for it to dry, you can always work on a different part if you don't need the whole thing to dry. If you're just waiting for one part to dry, feel free to work on another part of the painting while waiting, and that'll keep it interesting. And I'm really impatient, so it's hard for me to wait for things to dry, so I have to be doing something. Okay, so after I kind of do that and let the flower dry, I go in and paint the ladybug. So the ladybug, because it is so crisp and detailed, and it's a different color, I didn't want any bleeding between the ladybug and the flower. So that's why I really had to wait until it completely dried. And then I'm going in and I kind of outlined and then fill in the middle with clean water and just let the red bleed. And then I'm going in with a little bit more of a dark red. So to make a dark red, you can add a little bit of green, which is its contrasting color, or a little bit of brown, or a little bit of gray, just kind of depending on the tone of red that you're going for. But adding green is a good way to darken it. So that's kind of what I start with normally, is adding the contrasting color. And then after getting the basics of that ladybug in, again, now I need it to dry again. So I'm adding some white gouache now to the background. Again, very loosely, just it's creating depth and interest. Even though the black background is really blurred, it's just pulling up some highlights just so that it doesn't look like a big blob of purple. And then I am adding a little bit of highlight to the flowers on that detailed flower, create just more separation between the petals, and it kind of defines that a little bit and adds a little bit of light to it. It makes it feel like there's some light reflecting off of the petals. So I'm happy with using white gouache for this task. Some people are more purists and don't like using gouache, but I don't mind. So then again, once the ladybug was all the way dry, I went in and added the head and the feet, and I waited for it to dry so there would be no bleeding from the head into the body, because I really wanted to maintain that separation. And the flower behind the ladybug is also dry so that the legs don't bleed into it. And then from there, I work on the spots on the ladybug. So making sure I'm kind of getting the highlight making sure that it's where I want it before I add the spots in. But I did kind of add one spot on the top of the back before I did that. And then because I worked on the highlights some, I had to wait for it to dry again. So again, I wet up the background here, and I'm adding hints of stems and leaves, even more so for the background. But again, since I wet the background first, it doesn't stay really crisp. It bleeds out some. And I'm even forcing a little bit of extra, kind of bleeding out by adding in some more water next to those spots. Always, if you're not quite happy with how it turns out, if it's still wet, it's very easy to change it, so you can kind of blend it back out. So then I'm just going into the stem of the in focus flower and adding some white to highlight the lit side and adding a little bit of darker to add some shadows to it. Then same thing with adding another layer of white to the petals. So one thing with white gouache is it doesn't dry. It's not completely opaque. It still has some transparency. So if you really want a more crisp white, you can use a different medium, like an acrylic white acrylic, or a white paint pen or permanent marker or something. But if you're using white gouache, sometimes I just add more layers to make it a little bit more opaque. So then once that's all dry again, now I am actually going in and adding the spots onto the ladybug. So on the spot that is more in the highlight, it's a little bit lighter, and I did like a semicircle basically to make it look shiny, like there's a highlight on that black spot. And then on the other ones, I made them a little bit more solid. But that's a nice way to maintain or make something look shiny, is to maintain a little bit of white space for like a sharp highlight that looks like reflection. So then let that dry again, and then go in and deepen up the darkest parts of the black to make sure that it's the amount of contrast that you want. And so it's nice because you let it dry, you step back from it, and you can really decide where you need more detail or where you need just a little bit more contrast or a little bit more depth. So that's something that's kind of nice with watercolor, is you kind of, if you're not super impatient like I sometimes am, you have some forced breaks to step back and look at it while it's drying. And I do highly recommend that you use those times to truly step back a few feet and look at it. So then just adding a little bit of extra detail to the stem and making sure that there's a little bit of a highlight and a little bit of a shadowy side and just some texture on it. So using some yellowy green to add that texture here. And some of this is just kind of fiddling that probably didn't actually change the end results that much, but sometimes it's fun to just kind of fiddle with low stakes areas. And so that is the completed painting for the lavender with the ladybug on it. I don't have a good name for it. I need to come up with something, but I hope you enjoyed this painting process, and check out my channel for even more inspiration. Have an awesome day. Thanks for watching.